Rachael Jolley, and I'm the editor of the magazine. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. BBC foreign correspondent Lise Doucette wrote for us recently on the challenges of war reporting and how it's become even more difficult within her own career. She flagged up that we still need to think about the challenge of the fog of war, sifting fact from fiction, propaganda from reality, checking numbers with sources, and as she says herself, trying to find the truth doesn't get any easier. The future of journalism and journalists is in providing skills and information that isn't easy to Google, in asking questions and doing research, and having the skill to write it up in a way that makes sense to most of us. In this issue of the magazine, we looked at what that future holds and whether people would know more or less than they had done in the past. There are, of course, places where governments are blocking the news, blocking journalism, blocking the public from finding out what's happening in their own countries. Helen Womack reported for us from Moscow on Russia's last free radio station, and Natasha Joseph on journalists being imprisoned in Zimbabwe. We looked at how low-cost tech is helping journalists to expose information previously inaccessible. Ray Joseph paints a vivid picture of how one African newsroom is using smartphones in plastic bottles to detect dangerous levels of E. coli. Meanwhile, Iona Craig reports from Yemen on how other technology, drones, are tracking journalistic movements as they try and track down a story. So I'm hoping that all those themes and all the other stories in the magazine will inform the discussion today. If you haven't read the magazine, it's actually geocoded so that you can download it for free in the building tonight from the iTunes store or from the App Store. So do that and pick up on any stories you haven't caught yet. And with that, I'd like to introduce David Aaronovitch, who is going to introduce you to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'm David Aaronovitch. I'm a columnist of the Times, but more importantly here, I'm the chair of Index on Censorship and have been for just over the last year. And Index, just to give you a very, very brief introduction, is an organisation which is committed to furthering and protecting the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of expression in this country and everywhere else, and has been for well over 40 years. So that's us. The panel, well, actually, first let's talk about suggest the topic, Eyes Wide Shut, Will the Future of Journalism Mean We Are Better Informed, which is a fun, gorgeously optimistic title. And so on. I mean, I dare say if somebody had said we title something about the future of journalism, I'd probably have said, is there one? And nobody would have come. And so on. As it is, I see that we are better represented in the future of journalism here than we are in the past of journalism by some considerable way. And it's very good to see that, and I'm already feeling mildly encouraged. So I'll see whether the panel manages to keep me optimistic or actually take me into new depths of pessimism. Anyway, to introduce everybody right from the video screen, and on the video screen we've got Ray Joseph, who's over there in South Africa. Can you hear me, Ray? Right, that was a very sinister laugh. Was that gonna? I'm only gonna reply when I feel like it. Okay, right, very well. Anyway, hopefully, Ray, who's there in South Africa, who has been a journalist in South Africa with many different outlets for a long time, has been the mentor to many a journalist in South Africa, both before and since the fall of apartheid and so on, will have a take on journalism there under those sort of very difficult circumstances. Next to him, but not crackling, is Richard Sambrook. Richard and I worked together at the BBC until I left in 1994. I'm hoping that this is going to work. Richard and I, I'm sorry, Richard, I mean, this sort of very elegant introduction to you is being sort of slightly distracted from, but Richard was at the BBC to very senior positions at the BBC in journalism. He was even senior when I was there, so it goes to show you how ancient he is. And is now at Cardiff University Journalism School, where one of the most prestigious in the country, and obviously has a very kind of substantial and long take on this. Next to Richard is Rachael Breese. Now, Rachael has already said to everybody involved in this discussion, I don't know why I'm here. and that's why she's here. Um, Rachel is effectively the runner of Hostages UK, and the relationship that the press has in an area like the families, dealing with the families of hostages and reporting hostages, is not only a very kind of current problem and so on, but it's difficult to see it. It actually raises all kinds of questions about journalism, past and future, which are really interesting. So if you like, she is the person who should be giving us a hard time, because what journalism does impacts upon the sort of things that she tries to do. And then next to me is Amy Ferris-Rotman, again a hugely distinguished career in all kinds of extraordinarily dangerous places, including places like Afghanistan, working for Reuters, and I'm very, very glad to have them here. But in addition to them, and I turn over my little sheet of introductions, we have what we call a future panel, which is that we've asked a number of young people who are students of journalism or interested in journalism to act as a kind of panel, thinking about the things that the panel say and that you may be saying in the discussion, and then reflecting them back to us and saying what they think about them and so on. And they may talk during the discussion itself, or they may come up at the end and give us their judgment. It's really up to them to decide at what point you want to come in. You let me know. And I'll introduce them as we go on, because otherwise this introduction is going to go on for about 8 million years. So, each of the panelists have been asked to speak for about 3 minutes on the future of journalism, whether it means we are better informed. And Richard, I'm going to start with you. Go.
Thank you, David. All right. So, Eyes Wide Shut, Will We Be Better Informed is a very neatly done title, I think. So I think the answer is, will we be better informed, is yes, if we want to be. And I think I'll come to the if we want to be bit at the end. But I've got 3 minutes, so I'll make 3 points in 3 minutes. The first point, I was asked to talk a little bit about the differences between big media and small media, or I suppose you might say old media and new media, or however you want to construct it. And the obvious thing is that actually there are good things and bad things, advantages and disadvantages to both. Broadly, in terms of big media, legacy media, they still have the power, they still have the reach. Most people still get most of their news information from traditional news organisations. They have the resources to conduct investigations if they want to. They have the resources to withstand government or any other kind of pressures and intimidation if they want to. They have big brands, and brands are still very important for how people discover information in the new environment. But there are buts, because there are issues about corporate ownership. We know in the UK here we've had all sorts of issues about accountability and the overall plurality of media. And, you know, a lot of people are very pissed off with old media, bluntly. When you get to small media, the advantages, I think, are familiar to all of us. Is it's hugely innovative. There's some incredible creativity going on in data journalism and small media organisations, and through crowdsourcing in various ways and so on. And all of that is very healthy. It means new voices are being heard. It means new information, new stories are being told that we wouldn't get to otherwise. But they're small, they're fragile, they don't have the resource or reach, so they generally have to work in partnership in order to get that. They're not generally all that accountable, and some of them aren't very transparent. And quite often, small media is rather murky. Who's actually behind them? Sometimes it's government, sometimes it's lobbyists. You never quite know necessarily what's going on. But as I'm sure we'll hear from Ray, they also have made some extraordinary achievements as well. So there's good and bad in both ways, and that's just the way it is. Ideally, they complement each other, in my view. If people worked out that partnership model, then I think it can work very much to the advantage of both. Second point I would make, though, is that this fifth estate versus fourth estate might be another way of putting that big media, small media thing. This fifth estate, I hope, is very much here to stay, but as a networked journalistic body, it's entirely dependent on an open internet, and I won't take that for granted. Internet governance is the concern of everybody and the responsibility of nobody, and therefore it's rather fragile at the minute. You've got a lot of countries, we know them, we know about China, we know about Iran, who are building walls. We have other countries who would like to. We have companies and corporate interests who would like to separate off the internet in different ways. So internet governance and free and open internet is, I think, incredibly important to how much free access to information we'll have going forward. And I don't think we should take any of that for granted. And then finally, the third point I wanted to make was the if we want to point, because you'd expect this from somebody who's now an educator, but I think media literacy, news or information literacy is becoming increasingly important. One of the paradoxes that we have is that we have more information than ever out there and probably less trust in it than ever. I remember the great quote from Peggy Noonan, who was Ronald Reagan's speechwriter and a Wall Street Journal columnist after some conspiracy theory or other. She said, the fact of our age is that people believe nothing. When a government says A is true, half the people know A to be a lie, and when people believe nothing, they'll believe anything. And I think that is a problem that we're confronting at the moment. People don't always trust any media or any information, and they don't always understand how to judge whether it's reliable or not. Is it true? How do they know it's true? On what basis can they make those judgments? And increasingly, although people have access to the public space now through citizen journalism and technology, they also need to learn to take on the responsibility to understand what it is they're consuming. And I think we've got quite a long way to go in terms of that information literacy, but I think that's going to be vital in the future for people to really know more than they know now and really understand the world.
Of course, one alternative to knowing nothing is believing nothing is believing everything. I'm just finishing for review Russell Brand's new book on the revolution, and that's exactly what he believes everything. Amy.
Right. Well, considering I've spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent, I'm going to be speaking about foreign correspondence and how to finance them. A situation which is looking increasingly like a tragedy. So I think it's pretty clear that the depicted life of a foreign correspondent, the glamorous life of them being driven to their bureau in Paris by a chauffeur and living in a 5-bedroom flat, that we know from novels and from films is completely dead. Those days are over, and unfortunately, just finding adequately paid staffers abroad is becoming more and more rare. I saw this myself when I worked in Kabul, whereas the story wound down, and also as bureaus and news outlets hemorrhaged money, they slashed the number of foreign correspondents by a lot. I mean, bureaus were shutting down and people were disappearing, and this was in 2012. So, just to give you some figures, journalists love figures. According to the Media Standards Trust, British media has 40% less international coverage than it did 30 years ago. This is obviously because we can't pay the foreign correspondents who are out there doing their much-needed job. In the United States, Pew recently said the number of foreign correspondents working for papers, US papers, dropped by a quarter over the last decade. I obviously think this is a tragedy, but it is worth noting, as Richard pointed out, that we are in transition. There are digital-only outlets which are appearing, such as BuzzFeed and Vice, but accountability remains a major problem, as does financing. And of course, having listicles of cats and dogs next to people being blown up in Syria is still debatable over how successful that model can be. So what does this mean? What does this mean for foreign news reporting? I think it means we're seeing a terrifying pattern unfold, whereby staffers no longer really exist in foreign news bureaus, and instead we're seeing freelancers, lots and lots of freelancers around the world competing with each other for the better stories, the better jobs, the more prestigious outlets. And unfortunately what this means is it's becoming harder and harder to make a living because, of course, it's a market, and the more prestigious the outlet, unfortunately, the less they pay. That is what happened. That is what's been happening. As one freelance photographer who works in Afghanistan recently told me, he had put together all of his earnings from last month, and he realized he'd be better off hour per hour working at Walmart. So that gives you an idea of, and I mean, he's totally right, of the state of freelance journalism in a war zone even today. So what does this mean? Foreign reporting is becoming riskier, physically riskier to people's lives. Not only are freelancers without pensions, without job security, they're also at greater risk of being killed. The American James Foley, who is a stringer for AFP and Global Post, who was beheaded in August in Syria, totally demonstrates this point. Afterwards, the AFP, Agence France Presse, global head of news, produced a very brave manifesto, which I recommend all of you to read, even though it's really, really long. But it said that the news agency would no longer take work from freelancers in Syria and Iraq. I think this is really, really brave that they came out, massive news agency came out and did this, because it's really important, because people are being killed and are being hurt because they're not being properly financed and because the industry has taken that horrible hit. I encourage and think all other major news outlets should do as AFP have done. They have not. They should also be investing in foreign news reporting. They should invest in training and hiring local reporters who cost less money than foreign reporters and often produce better stories simply because they know their countries better. We don't really see a lot of that. Foreign reporting still relies, unfortunately, on this kind of model of the white savior, often male, who goes into these countries and produces these stories, often great stories, and obviously, that's also my profession, but I do think we need to really be training local staff for many reasons. And we also, what we're beginning to see a little bit of, and which I greatly commend, is global networks of freelancers. As people move more into freelancing, we're beginning to see these networks, which is great and should be encouraged, networks which help freelancers get connected to potential work and make sure that they get paid adequately for the work that they are doing. What's happened to journalism is, unlike other professions, such as being a doctor or being a lawyer, because of what's happened with the internet, as you all know, people think it's sort of a hobby. I mean, it's sort of something you should get for free. I mean, this is just totally unacceptable. So this is something which I think we can change, though. And yes, if something dramatic does not happen, if we do not change it, I think the world will suffer enormously. We're going to get less and less of a full picture, as we're already seeing by the numbers I gave you earlier. And as a world, we're going to be less and less informed, which I think is an absolute tragedy. So.
Okay. That's probably where I would have started, actually. With a nice gloomy edge. Ray, can you hear me? Ray Joseph, can you hear me? Right. Oh, you think he can't hear me? Okay. Raymond, can you hear me? Right, I don't know how to interpret that, but for the moment, I'm going to have to pass on that. I'm really sorry to Raymond there in South Africa, who's obviously, unfortunately the time zones are not very different, so it's not as if he's in the middle of the night. Right, okay. I'm just going to have the crackle's going to work for a bit. Rachel, do you feel you can talk through the crackle?
I will soldier on.
Yeah, you will.
Hi.
Oh, Ray. Hi.
So,
Ray, can you hear me?
Where I'm sitting here in Africa, we have our own very particular challenges. It's really what we are needing to do is to access communities. The mainstream, the legacy media, really the free and freelance. As Amy says about freelancers, people mistake that free as it all comes free. But where we're sitting, there are communities that we are desperately trying to, and the new tech is actually getting us there, but we don't have bandwidth, we don't have smartphones, they're all centered around the cities. And increasingly what we are doing is using appropriate technology. So SMS, we've got a tool here called Mixit, which uses very, very little data. And increasingly, we are digging out those voices. But what it does do, yes, there is a future for journalism, but increasingly more and more what we are going to have to do is to do the journalism. Because with all these voices that are out there, we're going to have to sort the news from the noise. There's a cacophony. You just need to look at what's going on Twitter. What's going on Facebook there. So when I went digging into the story, and I do quite a bit of myself as a data journalist, and I work a lot with techies building these tools. I don't code, but you don't have to be a mechanic to drive a motor car. I work very closely with coders. And as I began looking around, I think the one up in Mpumalanga, which is up towards the Zimbabwean border, incredibly poor up there. It's at the epicenter of the AIDS pandemic, and health There's a lack of toilets up there. People are not being serviced up there. Our government is letting them down very badly. And in the middle of it is a local newspaper with very, very few resources. And they've joined up with the African Media Initiative. And very simply, they've taken cool drink bottles and they've managed to get smartphones, old smartphones that they've collected along the way. And they're sealing them and submerging them in bottles. And what's happening there is they're taking regular photographs, which have been transmitted back to a database, which is comparing them against pre-existing slides to pick up E. coli. And in turn, what that does is it then sends by SMS messages to the women and to the girls, because there is no running water up there, access to running water. They are walking miles to different rivers looking for water, and they are getting an SMS which is saying to them, this river is safe, this river isn't safe. And it's made a huge difference there. What it's also done with those communities is it's actually given them the tools to take on government and say, we are having this problem, here is the proof. It's a local newspaper, very poorly resourced, which comes out once a month, and they then produce data of what stories of what they've done. They share that. There are radio programs. They are triangulating it, looking for the sources of where the E. coli is coming from. But what they've really done, and I think this for me is where the future is not only are they putting their audience at the center of the news, but they've turned them into news gatherers. You've got up in the Delta region in Nigeria, where very, very inaccessible, and journalists seldom get there unless there's a huge tragedy and then the firemen land there. And what they're doing there is they're flying drones and they are shooting footage, which they are then supplying to the media, to the media in the major cities for television. So what happens is these drones crash, and because they're so inaccessible, they are actually printing parts. They're printing parts. They're actually printing parts for these as replacements. Because you can't get there. And increasingly, we are seeing this. I'm working on a project at the moment using SMS where rather than mass audiences, what we're doing is we have a two-way communication that we're talking to people, and you start building up profiles. And what you start doing is looking for sources of trust. And what we are working to do is to reward people, because people don't keep doing something for nothing. So with airtime, with electricity, where we are able to give them this using a code, they can go out and buy it. Now, it might not sound a lot, but when you're in the middle of nowhere, where someone is giving you airtime, where you're getting electricity, it's making a huge difference. And increasingly, these projects are happening all over the place. The mainstream media in South Africa and in Africa largely is not investing. It's the independents, it's the African Media Initiative who are putting in the money there, because the mainstream, the legacy media in Africa certainly are still making money, and they don't see any value in spending on this. And the approach that we are taking here is we are not saying this is what you can do, we are showing them what they can do. Building a tool where medicines, a tool has been built where what we discovered is in South Africa for medicines, one price is being paid. In our neighbors in Botswana, another price. In Zambia is another price. A very simple price now gives the health departments the ability to check and say, but hang on a second, our neighbors are paying less. So it's really building tools that people can use.
Thanks, Ray. Thank you very much. A completely different perspective, but a push nevertheless on some of the things that you were saying earlier, Richard. Rachael, as the kind of outsider the non-journalist in this. And actually, it has to be said that we have quite a narrow definition here of journalism, because although on newspapers we call anybody who works for a newspaper a journalist, most people only recognise journalists as, a lot of people only think of journalists as people who work within the news remit. And in fact, actually, we call almost anybody who does fashion or anything like that a journalist as well. And one of the possibilities is that we take too narrow a view of what journalism is, and which we might want to come on to later. But as, in a sense, somebody who is continuously affected, and who the people you deal with are affected by journalism, may be affected by future developments in journalism, how do you see it?
Well, thank you. So I'm not a journalist, so I guess I'm here partly as a consumer of the media. And I'm in this sort of very strange position that I run an organisation, Hostage UK, that supports families during a kidnap and after, and returning hostages. And we're probably one of the few organisations, certainly in the country, who actively try very, very hard not to be in the media, not to comment, not to be sort of talking heads, because we feel that to do that would compromise our ability to be offering independent, confidential advice and support to the families that we're there to serve. So I'm not an analyser of the media, and I'm usually not a partaker in the media in anything other than a consuming basis. I wanted to actually also say that I'm not a media basher either. I'm probably not the person that's here to give the media a hard time, because a free press is vital. And I wanted to sort of centre my comments around the concept of citizen journalism. And I'll give you a really good example. I feel very positive, actually, about the developments in journalism that are offered partly by new technology. And I wanted to start by giving you an example of how the idea of citizen journalism is something that our families can benefit from. I spent Saturday up in Perth at the memorial service of David Haynes, who was murdered by ISIS a few weeks ago. Some of you may have seen a video clip that his brother Mike Haynes put out, that he had filmed himself and that he put out himself on YouTube. It came out on Friday, and if you haven't seen it, I really urge you to go and listen to a 5-minute clip of one of the most dignified and brave men I've ever had the pleasure to meet. And he was able to use this concept of citizen journalism himself to get his message out directly about how he felt about his brother and how he felt about the men and women who had been responsible for his murder. And he was able to get across his very positive message of unity and peace, which I'm sure you will have seen covered across the mainstream media over the course of the weekend as well. So I can, there are many examples I can see of my families being able to benefit from the media, but of course they do have a hard time at the hands of the media as well. I won't talk about that too much now, but happy to cover that in questions. But of course, citizen journalism is not just there for the good guys, it's also there for the bad guys. And actually what ISIS is doing at the moment is exhibiting citizen journalism par excellence. ISIS has turned itself into a broadcaster. It has turned itself into a series of journalists. It effectively runs its own news channel via many other platforms. It has become a publisher, and it has become a commissioning editor. And so let's not forget that the bad guys can use these tools as well as the good guys. And of course, the impact on my families is obvious, because I can tell you that whether they have people in Syria or Kenya or Afghanistan, they have been watching the events of the last few months very, very carefully, and they get up in the middle of the night to check Twitter, and they have CNN and ITN constantly, and Sky News on in the background, and they are being subjected to ISIS's very, very, very clever adaptation of the skills of citizen journalism. And that is my principal concern, is the impact that it has on them emotionally and physically and so on. But there are, of course, choices for the media in the broadest sense, whether that's national newspapers, whether that's TV stations, whether it's social media platforms, there are very important choices for all of those organisations to make about how they treat the citizen journalism of an organisation like ISIS. And it's been very interesting watching how those editorial choices have shifted since James Foley's murder a couple of months ago. We issued an open letter to journalists just over a week after James's murder was broadcast via YouTube, written by one of my trustees, Phil Bigley, whose own brother was murdered in the same way pretty much 10 years ago to the day that James was murdered. Asking media organisations the simple question, please think about the way that your editorial choices have an impact on families. Back in August when we issued that letter, the response that we got from the media organisations who bothered to reply to us was, we have to report the news, which I think is a completely legitimate position to have. Our argument was, do you still need to be using this image a week after this man's murder to illustrate any story about Syria? That is an editorial decision. That's not about covering the news. But, we're in unprecedented times. We've never seen the consecutive and systematic public murders of so many journalists in this way. And I've been encouraged, I think, in the way that what I can understand was a very difficult series of choices for media organisations to make in relation to one case which is bad enough. But I think actually we have seen those editorial choices maturing and developing as the murders have continued and continued and continued on a fortnightly basis, to the extent to which now we have the Sun newspaper with its, I think, quite beautiful front page showing a Muslim woman wearing a hijab in a Union Jack hijab and effectively saying, we will not be part of your propaganda machine. And so I think I raise this example really because I think it, in conclusion, it sort of strikes to the heart of a number of challenges that I should imagine editors in newsrooms are having to make. And I don't envy them that choice. But 4 things, I think. The first is the impact of editorial choices on ordinary people. I represent ordinary people. And, if we've seen anything from the dreadful scandals that have engulfed the media in recent years, it's a new appreciation of the fact that ordinary people matter and the treatment of ordinary people at the hands of the media matters. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, which is a real fundamental challenge that goes right to the heart of what the media is there to do, is actually I think journalists are starting to realise that actually they are being used as a propaganda machine for ISIS, and a sort of a rejection of being used in that way. The fourth is really I can understand the pressure on newspaper editors if the story is breaking on Twitter. I can understand the pressure that they face. And I think there's been something quite interesting has happened in the online space over the last couple of months, with, I think, the social media platforms starting to realise now that they're as much newspaper editors as newspaper editors are themselves, and they are shifting. So I think that opens up a third interesting area. And finally, of course, let's not forget there are business pressures, and I don't doubt for a moment that the editor of The Telegraph was not just making a newsworthy decision to put the photo of Stephen Sotloff with a bloodied knife being held by his executioner on the front page. That I suspect there was a little bit of business going on there. So I think for a simple story, I think it really does raise 4 quite fundamental challenges that go to the heart of what the next generation of media looks like.
Well, I think we do know why you were asked to come along. That was very interesting. Now there are some developing themes here. I mean, and of course each of you has raised something slightly different, but nevertheless they do fit together into some pictures. I've never heard the term legacy media before. That's what I am. Yeah, legacy media.
Yeah.
Legacy. Okay, that's right. And a number of other legacy media people around, and you can tell who they are. Hair colour, lack of hair, or whatever. But that remains, though weakened, strong, and still remains a relatively strong force, and will do for the foreseeable future in the forms of major television players, a few major newspapers, and so on. Yeah, radio and other broadcasters. Then we have the new and fragmentary market, which does all kinds of things, and media that begins to do all kinds of things that we don't expect, from what's going on in South Africa, which is to effectively empower people to say things themselves, to the sort of citizen journalism that you were talking about, Rachel, to the kind of freelance-based and highly entrepreneurial, essentially, journalism. That's what I see on Twitter, which is essentially effectively entrepreneurs offering their services and offering stories from around the place. And we have another kind which also fits into this mid category of the things that you're talking about, which might be quite close to ISIS in a certain kind of way, and in other ways not, which is new small media organisations which are highly entrepreneurial and which, as Richard said, we don't know how to evaluate. Sometimes damaging, sometimes good, and we don't know where they're going. So these are the kind of background things that we're talking about, and we're trying to push them forward. So, given that those are the things that we're talking about, who would like to give their short version or their short take on what it is that they've heard so far? Please feel free. And incidentally, also feel free, any of you, to come back on what other members of the panel have said or that have given you matters of interest. And we can take those themes in any kind of way. Yes, please. Have we got a microphone? The microphone's coming.
Hello, yes, I work for a think tank, and I think that that's another sort of area where you can look at. There's been a couple of reports recently talking about think tanks and advocacy groups such as HRW, Human Rights Watch, the Crisis Group, and they are actually doing journalism as well, or moving more into the journalism space. And there are problems with that as well too, because they are advocacy groups. So I just thought that's an interesting sort of fact to add.
So before you take the microphone away, how would you describe that as journalism?
Very often the crisis group, for example, would actually send its researchers into the field, and so they discover things that then, are reported. Instead of sometimes going through an intermediary of journalism, or of the journalists, they will actually publish a report themselves, which then sort of goes into the news that way.
So
and very often they are the only people on the ground sometimes in certain areas, in war zones, etc. Well, in places such as DRC.
Right. No, for sure, for absolute sure, which emphasises the point that you were making earlier. It brings me back to this interesting question about Mike Haynes. Why did Mike Haynes not give this as an interview to, let's say, a BBC channel, which then would quite possibly have put it embedded in its own site?
Yeah.
Why did he want to do that?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I wouldn't want to speak for him. But I do know, for instance, that he and Barbara Henning did give an interview to ITN, which was being used and syndicated on the morning of the memorial service. And I know how long the interview was that they gave, and I know all of the different topics that they covered during that interview. And I know that about 90% of it didn't get on air.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends, as somebody wanting to get your message across, I guess it depends how much you want to say and how much control you want to have over what you want to say. And let me imagine myself in that situation. Here was a man who wanted to get across a number of very important points about the death of his brother, about the impact on the family, but importantly, this message that he's very keen to stress around unity and communities coming together as a result of his brother's death, as opposed to it causing division. And there are obvious things that journalists want to ask people like him, and they're usually not those messages. So I don't want to speak for him at all, but I would imagine that he had a very clear set of messages, wanted to ensure that he got those across, and as I say, the ITN interview certainly didn't allow him to give as much detail.
Richard.
Yeah, David. I mean, one of the problems we have, and this is, the discussion tonight is labelled about the future of journalism, is how we define journalism. Of course, I'm not going to try and impose it on you, but either you say everything's journalism, and any expression in the public space is journalism, and everybody's a journalist. If they manage to put something on YouTube or send somebody and publish something, we're all journalists now, and that's a perfectly reasonable view if you want to take that position. And I absolutely celebrate the kinds of things that Ray was talking about, or the ability of the Hennings to take control of their own story and communicate directly. I think all of that is fantastic. So there's a lot of positive stuff there. I personally take a narrower view of journalism, because wouldn't I, after 30 years and now teaching journalism and all the rest of it, and I think there's something about journalism which is about independent scrutiny, and there's something about the kind of public interest responsibility of journalism, and there are real skills in that which not everybody has. And therefore I personally don't like the term citizen journalism, because I think most people who are uploading pictures aren't doing it and thinking of themselves. Some of them are thinking of themselves, I'm going to be a journalist now, fine. A lot of them have just seen something and want to share it. And a lot of them don't have the skills of editorial judgment. And editing, the point Rachel made about the use of the ISIS pictures is a very good one. I can think of other examples. If you're a television news program editor, as we were during a war, how graphic are the images that you show? And you make that judgment.
Well, just to say, that wasn't the Second World War.
There were several of them. Anyway, but making that judgment is very difficult, and you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Either you're sanitising it, or you're putting horrific images into people's front rooms and so on. So editing is about the application of judgment, and not everybody has the skill and the experience to apply that judgment and to work it through. And there are other very real, small p, because we're not allowed to have a capital P on journalism in this country, professional journalistic skills that not everybody has. And that's the view that I would take, but other people would say, that's gone, forget it, everybody's a journalist now, and simply the act of public expression is an act of journalism.
Ray, did I catch a desire to come in at this point of the conversation from South Africa? There might be I sort of felt, kind of intuited, that there... Yeah, okay. Ray, can you hear me? In South Africa? Oh, yeah. Right, I can't really see what he's doing or hear what he's doing. So,
He's waving.
hi, Ray. Did you hear any of that?
Probably not.
I feel I'm kind of halfway into a séance here, so I'm trying I'm kind of waiting for signs of kind of odd sorts of sounds of this.
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
So I agree with that. The term citizen journalist, I prefer citizen reporter, because really what they're reporting is they're not bringing journalistic insight to it. But I think the reality is the reader, the listener, the viewer, formerly known as, is now a publisher in their own right. And I think what we've got to come to terms with is, in the old days, someone wrote a letter to the editor, which may or may not be published. If it was published, it may or may not be edited. Now they are just going to platforms, but going to a platform and publishing themselves. And I think now more than ever, the skills that we have as journalists are so vital. Verification. I mean, I just look at some of the stuff that goes on Twitter, and some journalists are major offenders. I mean, how many times was Nelson Mandela killed off before he died? Margaret Thatcher before he died? And I think increasingly, and I would hope that it's happening amongst the educators, is that verification, because we've got a whole world opened up to us. But it's a very dangerous world if we're just going to dive into it. So one of the things that we are doing in South Africa is we're going into communities, and we are trying to teach to the best of our abilities basic journalism to people. How do you know? Who do you know? What do you know? And giving them those tools, and the ability to tell stories, and then working with them because left to their own devices, I mean, it's a bit of a wild west out there. So I would absolutely agree with my colleague who's training young journalists that I don't believe everyone is a journalist. I think everyone has got a story to tell, but whether it's journalism, I would question that. And I think that we as journalists, what we need to do is to take that into account and do the journalism. Don't leave others to do the journalism. They can do the reporting. We need to do the journalism.
Thanks very much, Ray.
Thank you.
Amy.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, citizen journalism, citizen reporting has its merits, but on the whole, I think it needs to be taken with caution. It's also contributed, perhaps, to the decrease in money available and also job positions for foreign correspondents. I think it's made a huge dent in that. It's also given rise to these interesting verification services, which are these new, also there's a few verification agencies which have popped up, which are trying to actually verify and make, and there's even, at Stanford, a lot of people were trying to, when I was there last year, were trying to create verification algorithms. No one really came up with it, but you know, it's...
Algorithms? What is a verification algorithm?
Well, some kind of magical algorithm which will figure out if a story is real or not. There are people being paid enormous sums to work on this. But
It's going to have a kind of columnist algorithm to tell whether an argument's crap or not. We'll be in trouble.
You'll probably be a millionaire if you. But yeah, and so, but the fact that these verification services, at least the human ones at the moment, have sprung up brings this vital question of who are these citizen journalists and reporters? I think it's a very valid question. I think, fortunately, we are moving a bit away from it compared to a few years ago.
Okay. Do we have another point? Yes. Personally, we get the microphone over to you.
I think there's a massive difference between reporting and responsible journalism. And certainly for me, and I think for probably everyone sitting on the panel here, the ethics and the morality of reporting the truth, of being objective, because editorial is different than being able to be a responsible journalist. You have to report all the different sides and so on. And for me, the citizenship journalism, which was coined before, which I think is inaccurate, is the same kind of what I call visual and verbal diarrhea that appears on Facebook. You know, these people don't edit stuff. They have one point of view. I look beautiful in this picture. Should I be sexting it or should I put it up on Facebook? And what we're ending up with is an avalanche of visual and verbal diarrhea that we can't cut through the clutter. And I think as a responsible journalist, that I think I am, and the kind of reporting for me which is really important, and I'm visual, so it's visual pictures. I don't fuck around with my images. I don't crop them. They're not manipulated in Photoshop, giving green eyes to purple eyes and all the rest. It is what it is. And if the picture isn't good enough, then it's not in the cut or the edit. But you have to report objectively. And I think what's happening now with this avalanche, and it is an avalanche, we should be discussing this, is how does the average citizen out there be able to cut through the clutter, cut through the bullshit, and find out the truth, and without the bias. And that's the challenge that I think we have in front of us.
Well, as a visual journalist yourself, you have given me a visual image. An avalanche of diarrhea is something. Now, there you are standing underneath a hill and you think it's kind of brown up there. Yes, one of our future panel would like to say something. So if you would like to tell us which of the future panel you are, just introduce yourself. That would be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Mari. I currently work freelance at the Associated Press Television News, and I also work as a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. I was going to initially say something different, but following all the comments, I've just noticed something is that we are, the panel and everyone else has been saying, well, let's say, critically looking at the role of a citizen journalist or reporter, however we want to define it. But the reality is that increasingly, young people are expected to embrace these methods of reporting, you know, whether it be using YouTube or Instagram or Twitter, and we are expected to have these skills and bring it into newsrooms. And I myself was formerly a musician. I was at music school. I played the piano. In fact, my parents blocked me from television or newspapers. And it was only because I fell into literally, luckily, a prestigious university that allowed me to educate myself through watching BBC iPlayer and consuming the news online, that I gained some form of knowledge. And then eventually found myself, working with a local charity who ran a so-called citizen news channel. And to be honest, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I did produce a 30-minute video about how the Japanese tsunami was being reported in the media. Admittedly, now I would have not made that film, and I'm quite embarrassed by it. But that was the calling card for me to get funding from the BFI, which subsequently got me a job at, freelance work at the AP. And now with that knowledge, I'm able, I feel a bit more skilled and I know what my mistakes are. But I guess my question to the panel is, you criticize these mediums, but if you're expecting us to commit to it in some way, surely there needs to be some appreciation of it rather than just saying
Sure.
that it's not right.
I'll be getting to answer your question in a moment, but I want to ask you one very quick. What do your parents now think of you being a journalist, given that they wanted you to be a musician?
Well, they did want me to get married to a rich banker and play the piano all day. So when I say that, I was in Iran last year on holiday, or my best friends are, basically video journalists on the Russian-Ukraine border, they're a bit confused. But it turns out that I have a grandfather who I had never met, who was a television reporter during the Vietnam War, and he worked for a Japanese news channel. Unfortunately, he died before I was born. But I would absolutely love to have that conversation with him if he was ever.
It's in the blood, obviously. I just to pick up on that, if I could, David. I mean, I'm not against social media at all. I think it's fantastic. What I say to students is, social media is fantastic for two things. It's not news or journalism. It's like being in the bar, and you may hear something in the bar, or you may hear something on the bus. That just because you've heard something doesn't make it journalism. It makes it raw information. It might make it a lead. It might make it something else that could become journalism. But it's just a source of raw information. But it's a fantastic source of raw information. But it's also distribution and marketing. Let's be honest about
But what do you make of this, of some of the new kind of intermediaries? Because they certainly do exist. I mean, the most obvious one is, for me, is a tweeter called Brown Moses, who some of you will have heard of. Who essentially, with a number of other people, using information which you can find on the internet and knowing how to use it, has done some extraordinary stuff, both on the origin, at the point where the Syrians dropped the sarin gas on their own people and so on. And there was, everybody was saying, we don't know what happened, we can't quite tell. Everybody's been very careful about it. And then there were whole lots of people who, for various reasons, wanted to deny that it was Assad, went into it and said, well, it looks very much like this and for this and this reason, and then did exactly the same over MH17, when most of us could realise that it was most likely that the separatists had done it using Russian weaponry, but we couldn't say so, and actually tracked by photographs the movement of this the anti-missile.
He happens to use Twitter, and he happens to have a blog, but he has become an incredibly specialist journalist in his own right. Of course, he has, and he's producing incredibly valuable information and investigations. But he's not sort of married to Twitter. He happens to use Twitter very effectively.
Citizen journalism.
Well, he started
in the truest sense of the meaning of those words.
Yeah.
Because what he did is, after he got a lot of the data, he then examined through Google the surrounding villages from where he thought the
So he has done what
bombings had
I said before. He has applied judgment. He's used judgment. He's taken information and put it through what we would call an editorial process to make it journalism.
He got people on the ground to send him photographs from different angles, so that he did indeed act as the journalist, putting the story together, but he used the citizens from places that he would never have gone near to actually help him deliver the story.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's great.
So I'm going to take the question at the back, and then I'm going to take it in two or three, and then we're going to come back and have the panel respond. So there's, the woman there, and then the gentleman a little bit further on, and the gentleman behind. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask what the
Take
panel
three.
see as the impact of surveillance on the future of journalism, both the PRISM Snowden revelations and the now increasing understanding of the pervasive use of surveillance all over the world. So on journalists themselves, on what they report, their own safety, and on the safety of their sources. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a surveillance question, and we'll take your question now.
I live in West London, and I've seen the consequences of citizen journalism in the recent sad event of Alice Ross's death, which...
We didn't quite...
sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm from West London,
Yeah.
and recently, if you've heard, a young lady was murdered in West
the
London.
Alex Gross case.
Alice, yeah. And citizen journalism created a lot of confusion, a lot of despair among people in West London. But what I want to come to is that since 2003, we've seen a decline in public trust in journalism itself. And the problem that we have now is not do the public trust what the citizen journalists say? Is do the public trust what the actual journalists say? Coming from the WMDs, coming to Syria, coming to the Israeli and Gaza wars, people are asking questions that the journalists do not dig deep enough and do not go far enough to find out the truth.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman at the back there. I don't know why that's come off, that microphone, but it has.
It's okay, I can be quite loud.
It's just for the recording, it's the posterity.
Of course, and I love that. Hi, my name is John D. McHugh. I'm a photojournalist and filmmaker and writer, and I've worked in Afghanistan for many years. And I want to come back to citizen journalism, I'm sorry, and I don't like that term. And I'm with Richard on this. I think that it's important to talk about the idea that this information that we're getting from news sources has a value, but journalism is about interpretation and analysis and repackaging our own thoughts and opinions and delivering them to people in succinct packages. So citizen journalism is, as I think lots of us will agree now, it's the wrong terminology to use. The content they produce, UGC, user-generated content, people have talked about a lot, but there's a move within certain circles to move away from that and to call it eyewitness media. And I think this idea of eyewitness media, identifying the content that we're getting as useful in its own right, like something we hear in a bar, but it's information, it's raw information that we have to interpret and we have to utilize. But I also sense a lot of, I won't say aggression, but resistance to this new world that we live in, the future journalism. It's also very cute to hear somebody from legacy media say it's the first time I've ever heard legacy media used.
And I hope it's the last.
It won't be. But the point I'm trying to make in the question I want to generate here is, this is not going away. Eyewitness media, user-generated content, citizen journalists, accidental eyewitnesses, whatever the hell we call it, it's not going away. And I think that we all have to be thinking about how we utilize it, how we bring it into journalism, rather than trying to disparage it or say that Brown Moses is just a tweeter. It's incredibly important to use it, but we also have to figure out these definitions, because I got very angry earlier when I heard about ISIS propaganda being described as citizen journalism, because it clearly is not. And I was part of the ISIS blackout group who said, we shouldn't use these images, but it's not bloody propaganda. It's not citizen journalism, it is propaganda. And we need to get these definitions figured out if we're to move forward.
I'd like to ask you a very quick question. What would you classify the RT channel as?
Sorry, say again?
What would you classify the RT, formerly Russia Today channel as?
I would classify it as a lot of things, but for posterity, I think it would be inappropriate for me to go into it.
Well, okay.
I've refrained from swearing all the way through this, but you're pressing me.
But what it means is that we have any number of stages along this particular road, doesn't it? Anyway, we have three questions there, and I'd incidentally like to mix in, before I come to Amy first, the point you made initially, Richard, about because we raised the question about surveillance journalism. Not just about surveillance journalism, but also about the possibility, partially as a consequence of a reaction or a claimed reaction to surveillance journalism of the internet being patriated to governments and controlled by governments who want to use this as an excuse effectively to control the internet in their own countries. But Amy, from what you've heard so far, pick up whatever you like.
Well, to go back to the social media and the dreaded citizen journalism and all of that, I just there's a huge fuss being made over it, and it does seem that we're swimming in all of this avalanche of poo or whatever it was. I think we have to kind of take a step back and think just that, even though there is this flow of unchecked content and it is quite irritating and very noisy, that the same rules apply as have always applied. And I think a lot of people are not understanding that or thinking that through, that if you're a good journalist, you live by certain principles, you've been trained a certain way, to think objectively, to have freedom of bias, to present, a nuanced view of events, and I think that can apply to social media as well. But it's the same rules as it was 100 years ago when you're a journalist. You're just dealing with different mediums, and unfortunately, a lot more of them. I mean, the whole thing about someone mentioned less trust in the media. I think that goes hand in hand with the fact there's just more information around. I don't know, that's what I think. That yes, maybe there's less trust in the media because there's more noise out there, because there's more access to information, even if the information is not real information or verified information. Whereas, so it's just kind of what the internet has done, what self-publishing has done, as opposed to how things were 50 years ago when you went out and bought a newspaper. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. I'm going to do the Hamlet to the ghost thing again. Ray, can you hear me? Do I need... You think you can't? You think it's just the delay? Okay. You think he can't hear me, and they think it's the delay. I'm going to go for the delay. Ray, don't delay. At what point are you going to decide it's not the delay? Okay, right. I'm going to start to say something, and then he will start. This is what's going to happen. Rachel, I think if you could pick up some of the themes that any of the themes that you've heard so far that that you've been interested in. I mean, we had three.
I can.
Carry on. Carry on, Ray.
I can hear you.
Oh, great. Would you like to comment on any of those questions?
I can. So if I may answer the young lady, yeah, sure.
Good.
I think it's about a 5-minute delay.
Yeah. I don't know. It would actually be easier to get the pictures of the sanitation in the northwest part of South Africa, wouldn't it?
So what I wanted to do is yes, I would. I think the young lady the musician turned journalist, I think the people to young journalists, they've got a very tough time. I come from hot metal. That's how far back I go. And what you did is you worked in print, and that's what you did. Today, you really need to be platform agnostic and working on multiple platforms. Journalists are going out, they're tweeting from where they are, they're live blogging, they're live tweeting, they're going back to the office and they're doing something for the net. And then they're posting to Facebook, and then they've still got to come up with something for print. And increasingly, that is what is happening. Fewer and fewer people are doing more and more. But these multi-talent, that is the future. And us people from legacy media, well, we need to get with the program, because that's where it's going. And what I would like to say about social media is, again, coming a long way with journalism. I look at Twitter, and I believe that is one of the most powerful tools that's been put into the hands of journalists. Unfortunately, a lot of people associate Twitter with tweeting. And a lot of journalists who think they're very good at Twitter are actually good at tweeting. But it's a very, very powerful tool, investigative tool, research tool, building sources. I think you need to look what Andy Carvin was doing during the Arab Spring, where he was literally crowdsourcing a newsroom using Twitter and asking questions. And so I think we need to understand that social media is not a means to an end. It's just another tool that journalists can use, and we should be using it. But I really do feel for the young journalists of today who are having to do everything and more with less and less. Fewer people are having to do more and more.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we have somebody who either is or wants to be a young journalist, another one of the future panel. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Rima Amin. I'm currently the president of Students' Union at City University, and I also studied journalism there. From what I'm hearing, it's quite obvious that the role of a journalist is very different to a citizen reporter in terms of how they verify information, and actually, could use raw footage and provide that kind of narrative based on truth. Is it simply a case of getting the wider public to understand the difference between a journalist? And essentially, how do we do that? And will that actually help resolve the issues around trust in terms of how you construct a story and how you put it together and why you do that?
I'm interested in the way that you haven't asked the question which would have occurred to me were I in your position, which is, who the hell am I going to work for? We talk. I learned a lot of different phrases. I mean, obviously, legacy is one of them, and I hate it. Platform agnostic is another phrase that I've just learned this evening, and so on. But I would want to know where it was that I was going to use any of this. And we've had some of the discussion about freelancers around the place trying to sell stories in. Also, you set up these networks on Twitter, and I absolutely agree with what Ray said. I think that Twitter is the most useful journalistic tool that has been invented in the last, certainly since I came into the business. There's no two ways about it. If you use it properly, it drives me crazy when people say, "Oh, I can't be bothered with Twitter." It's just, it is because it is precisely what you make it and how you fashion it in yourself, and it takes some skill to do it. But nevertheless, I completely agree with you. But it would have occurred to me to think, if legacy media is getting less, where am I going to do this stuff, and who's going to pay me to do it? Effectively, who's going to win out in this kind of business? Is it the case that eventually most of what we call journalism will actually be done by people who are doing completely other jobs most of the time and are earning little bits and bobs on the edges of doing freelance stuff as a result of networks that they've come to on social media? Richard, and then
just to pick up on that and then give very briefly on a couple of the other points. I mean, journalism, had a privileged status because there was a gatekeeper kind of role to it. Not everybody had access to public space, so therefore, if you were, on a top newspaper or broadcaster, you could earn a lot of money. Those days have gone. It's all broken down, so there isn't the same money in news and journalism that there was. I'm sure at City it's the same as in Cardiff. If you come out and you're young and you're well trained, you can get a job because actually you're quite cheap. And a lot of places need young, well-trained people who aren't going to cost them a fortune.
Do you mean you're cheaper than the old ones?
Yeah,
you're replacing?
exactly. That's exactly what we're seeing happen in every news organisation. Now, what happens in 10 years' time is what worries me. Actually, if you come out at 22 and you're well-trained, you can find work. What happens when you're 30 or 35 is a different matter. So, and I don't know the answer to that. Just to pick up a couple of things on the UGC point, UGC is not going away, but then it's always been with us. We've always used pictures from the public. There's a Pruder film of Kennedy with UGC. It's always been here. It's just the scale is now so enormous that it has a big impact on how the rest of the business works. So it seems to me that's fairly straightforward. To pick up the point about do we need to kind of teach the rest of the public? Yeah, there's a difference between journalism and PR and propaganda and advertising and lobbying, and these are all entirely different things. And people, I think, there's no reason why they should. Members of the general public understand it, but in this new environment, if they don't understand that difference, then there is a problem, and they're consuming things that they don't, like junk food. They're eating junk food without realising it, if you like. And so there is a public education issue there. I don't know how we solve it, but just to pick up finally on something you said, even within journalism, there are different kinds of journalism.
Sure are.
And you asked the RT question, you know, if you work for certain British newspapers, you can't write a pro-European story, David. So, you know, that's no different.
Yeah. However, that does not apply to me.
Of course.
Rachel.
Listen, I'm not a journalist, so forgive me if I'm using journalistic terms incorrectly, and I certainly am not an advocate or an endorser of anything ISIS related. So forgive me if I have given them any credit that they are certainly not due. In a sense, though, I don't know how much any of this terminology really matters. I mean, sorry to say that to a room of insiders who think, you know, quite rightly think a lot about these issues and are, I quite understand, trying to feel their way through a sort of a very, very rapidly changing landscape. I get it, but as a consumer of the media, I don't get it at all. And I listen with interest to your definition of what a journalist is, actually, because you talked about investigation and verification and so on. And does that mean that, forgive me, David, does that mean that a columnist is a journalist?
Yeah, as I said,
you have to ask this question.
Depends on the columnist, Rachel, obviously. But
of course. But does that mean that a columnist who writes nothing more than their opinion is a journalist or not? Not on your definition. And I have to say, I've got one other point.
Let me just say, the key point of my definition was independent scrutiny. And the point about journalism is there's a degree of independence. That's what differentiates it from PR, from propaganda, from lobbying, from advertising. And when you consume a lot of stuff on the web, you don't know whether it's independently produced or not.
But I'm independent. Nobody's paying me to write my blog.
No, but you will write from the position being, you know, from the issues around hostages.
Okay.
But columnists write about the issues that they care about and they feel passionately about. It's no different.
No, I agree.
But also, I have to say, having worked in a think tank for many years, I know that quite often the press release you send to the newspaper ends up being the article that they write as they write. So, you know, let's be honest about it. There are good journalists and there are bad journalists. There are journalistic standards to which all journalists should aspire, but many don't reach. So I'm sort of a little less tight to those.
Richard, before we do, this is fascinating. But I'm now getting lots of hands.
But can I just also make one other point very, very quickly? And this is genuinely as a consumer of media, and it sort of goes back to the Mike Haynes point. And that is that I think many people are fed up with the way that what they view and read in the media is so mediated. And I think actually the reason that we're seeing the popularity of people accessing sources such as that is because I think that the media is getting it less right and less right over time about how to mediate and the choices that are being made. That's how I feel as a consumer of media.
No, you can't come back on that yet, Richard. Okay, so we're going to take some more from the room, and there's a chap over here, and then there are two at the back.
David, I wanted to answer your question about where will you work with something that I think has been missing from tonight's discussion hugely. And so where will you work? Perhaps it's for brands. And I wanted to know what people thought about that. I saw a job advert came up on LinkedIn for me recently, editor-in-chief. I've been in journalism editing. Editor-in-chief for a new interactive story lab. This is sounding absolutely great to me. Then I noticed it was advertised by Ogilvy, and I got a little bit, interesting. And then as I read through it, it said, for a major energy company client. And I thought, editor-in-chief. When I went to journalism school, I didn't think I'd be applying to do that for Ogilvy, for a brand on a contract that was related to their success of continuing to have that client, which is what happened when you read into it. And it related to another thought I had earlier about brands, which was that this story about, I don't know if you know, the dental hygienist who started a blog about the blue stuff she kept finding in people's gums in America. And she started blue things implanted in people's gums. And she couldn't figure out what it was, and so she investigated and asked other people, and more. Turns out there's plastic in like almost all of the toothpaste that's made in America. It's going into the ocean, and it was even more toxic in the ocean than it was for people. Now, this is something that was off the mainstream agenda, but she took a brand to account. And so I'm just wondering, as we're talking about politics, terrorists, ISIS, if we're not thinking, or if brands who are both needing to be part of the cycle of influencing news, but also being held to account more, even though they're ones who often pay for the news, is something that's missing from tonight's conversation.
Good point. Yeah. Person down there, we've got to go right down the back there. Oh, no, we've got one there. Sorry, Dave, you know.
Hi, my name's Iona Craig, and just going back to the question on the surveillance issue, I've been reporting from the Middle East for 4 years now, and also as a freelancer and for the Times. I wrote the piece in the magazine about the exact issue of surveillance. I'm probably more paranoid than most of my colleagues, and in fact, a lot of them take the mickey out of me for it. But I have literally had people watching my house. As a journalist in Yemen, where I live, you know that the local intelligence agencies are certainly listening into your telephone conversations. And then, of course, because, again, you're living in Yemen and everything, as far as America is concerned, related to Yemen equals terrorism, they're reading all your emails. So with that in mind, as what I tried to explain in what I wrote really was that for journalists on the ground, a lot of the time, it's actually about a regression. It's about realizing that communicating with people one-on-one is, for the moment anyway, the way forward. Because of exactly what we know now. I mean, people were always, particularly in sort of police states, which Yemen isn't, by the way, under threat from local intelligence agencies. But I think now we're just more aware that even email communications that may be being picked up, whether it be by GCHQ or the NSA, may also being passed on to local intelligence agencies as well, and that information is being shared. I think that has two impacts, really. For freelancers ourselves, I think everybody is a little bit behind on all of this. We're still trying to play catch-up. The idea of using encryption, I was actually doing it before the Edward Snowden thing came to rise, but editors are not. They're really quite backward in this. Maybe we can blame this on legacy journalism. I don't know, but it's sort of editors you're dealing with back away from where you're working from, saying to them, I can't have this conversation by email, do we do this encrypted or whatever? And they're like, how do we do that? And it could take them a week before they can actually work out. And by that stage, it's too late, you know. The story has either moved on or whatever you're trying.
Greenwald 6 months or something, didn't it? So
yeah, I mean, it's and so we're still playing catch up on that at the moment. And I think also it's about protecting ourselves and the work that we're trying to do. Otherwise, we're just giving governments the heads up about what work we're doing, if it's investigative work, where we're going on a day-to-day basis, when you're trying to do investigations against a government, and you're already making it so easy for them. But it's also about protecting your sources, and that's so important, really. And I think a lot of editors sometimes blame them, it's probably not quite right, but editors back home maybe forget that, whereas on the ground, because you're feeling it every day, it is something that you have to take into account. So, I mean, I've got to the stage now where I will deliberately leave a false trail. You ring up the wrong people and you say to others, I'll meet you there, and you're going to meet them somewhere else. You leave your phone at home, much to your editor's frustration, because you know that people are going to know where you are because you're leaving a data trail if you take your phone with you. So it's actually almost about going back in time slightly when you're dealing with it on the ground. For now, anyway, until everything catches up, until I can have a phone that is automatically encrypted and isn't going to cost me several $100s. Because as a freelancer, as we all know, we get paid shit, so you're not going to be able to afford that for a while. So yeah, it really, on a practical basis, as far as the future is concerned, I feel we're actually kind of stepping back to be able to take all of that into consideration.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I have to say, Ian is one of the best people I follow on Twitter. I would have absolutely no idea what was going on in Yemen, really, if it wasn't for you. But I had expected you to be more tanned, I must say. Anyway, there was somebody up there as well, I think, in the same vicinity who had their hand up earlier.
Yeah, it was me. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Paul Raymond. I work for Newsfixed, which is one of the agencies that Amy mentioned. We work in this kind of space between traditional media organisations and freelancers around the world, and we try to help both sides to reach each other. And we try to help freelancers in sort of eastern Ukraine and Yemen and other places to find work. And I'm just wondering, Amy, you mentioned I'm not sure if you quite said it in this phrase, but I think it's quite nice, white savior journalism, where there are so many sort of fairly well-off, white, rich people from rich countries going to quite difficult parts of the world to cover them. And I'm wondering if there's a way that organizations like my own and organizations, say, like the Rory Peck Trust and others, could support some of these local journalists. And we've tried to do things like, for example, we have some very good journalists in places like Baghdad who write fantastic journalism, but can only do so in Arabic. And so we've managed to get some of their work commissioned from Baghdad, translated it ourselves, and then passed it on to organizations that initially commissioned it. Problem is there's a whole load of back and forth, and it's not really workable as a business model. But I'm wondering if you have other ideas about how we could be supporting local journalists and bringing, people in places like Mali, people in places like Djibouti, and very difficult to operate environments into more mainstream media, and actually also kind of bringing a greater degree of professionalism into those, in terms of the content that's coming from those countries. Because often there's a lot of stuff out there. If you go on Twitter, you can find material, you can find news, or you can find apparently facts, like being in a bar, from just about anywhere with a very simple search, but you have no idea whether it's verifiable, you have no idea whether it's from someone who actually has that editorial judgment or not. And I'm wondering how it would be possible to sort of bridge that gap and empower people on the ground in less covered or more difficult to cover places to provide good coverage.
Can I just insert into that thought the possibility that there's a value in white saviours? Well, in this sense, which is that it means that somebody from your organisation is invested in being out there. Because I could quite easily worry about a situation whereby organisations become almost completely disconnected from abroad because they just simply don't ever send people out from here to there. But anyway, that's just a thought. I can tell you disagree with that, but that's fine.
Well, I could argue the opposite, yeah. But that you're increasingly disconnected if you only use the white saviour model. That you've got these kind of roving, as I said, usually male correspondents going. I mean, I was in Afghanistan, and as you know, it's full of these kind of guys who also go around the world and often, nothing against men, but I mean, like often do not know the story as well as they should. And I think, that, as well as local reporters do know. And I think that there is a huge disconnect and a huge gap between getting local reporters out there. And I think, to answer your question, Paul, I think that there are wonderful local reporters everywhere in every country, and I just think that we haven't found them. We're using them as stringers and fixers, even even lower. And I mean, when I was this was my whole thing about when I was a Stanford Fellow last year. I was incensed that there were no Afghan female correspondents working in any of the foreign news bureaus in Kabul. It drove me crazy. There were and even though I would see them at Karzai's press conferences, and no one was hiring them, and I didn't understand why this was going on. And anyway, so I'm trying to create a project to fix that. So I think they're there. It's just that because of the white saviour image, there's a lot of intimidation. A lot of people do not think that they are ready or able to have those jobs. They're not being trained and properly. The investment is not being made in them. But yeah.
Yeah, wait for the microphone to get to you. Add it quite quickly.
I'll be very quick. I just wanted to say that the one piece that I was thinking of that we commissioned from this guy in Baghdad, he had such local knowledge that when he was... So it was just after ISIS had rolled into Mosul, and everyone was flocking to the ticket officers and the passport officers to try and find some way out of Baghdad, and everyone was trying to get their passports fixed. And one girl was waiting at the window of the passport office, and she went up to the guy and said, "When you call out, I'm here to collect my brother's passport. When you call out, when it's ready, please don't call out his name, because his name is Omar." And Omar, of course, for Shias is like a red rag to a bull. There's a lot of sectarian violence in Baghdad. And so, first of all, being able to understand that conversation, which is in Arabic. Secondly, getting the significance of it culturally in terms of the sectarianism and so on, understanding what Omar means is like how many Western correspondents, how many people from another culture, the other side of the world, are going to understand that? So you get such an intimate understanding of the story.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel something emerging, but I have to say that actually time is moving on a bit, and I do want to get some more opinions from our future panel or kind of feelings about it. So if we've got a microphone at the front, all those of you who haven't said anything yet, if you'd like to, it'd be great to hear from you.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. I'm a journalism with human rights student at Kingston University. And I just think that the debate around citizen journalism or citizen reporters, so I kind of agree when you say it doesn't matter what we call them, they're there. And I think as journalists, and I don't think everyone can be a journalist, I quite get upset with that as well, because I've just done a course in journalism for 3 years, and I come out and people are telling me that everyone is a journalist. It isn't true.
Yeah, you don't want to hear that, do you?
No, I don't. And I don't think it's true. I think I agree when you say that there's a certain set of skills that journalists have that make them journalists. But I think with citizen journalism, shouldn't we be using that as journalists? Twitter is a powerful tool, and I know every story I've reported on at university, I have absolutely used Twitter. And I think increasingly, because of citizen journalism, it's becoming impossible to be someone who isn't well informed. Even if I know a lot of my friends who just don't read the news, they can't go on Facebook or Twitter anymore without finding out what is happening in the news. And I think because of that rise of citizen journalism and everyone reporting on everything, and the fact that we do have journalists who are able to sift through that information and give the public what is accurate, in the future, we are going to have a public that's very well informed because we have journalists who are able to go through that information
That's
and present
optimistic.
it to us.
Please.
Hi, I'm Beth Lyons. I'm a third-year student at Cardiff Uni, and I currently run Cardiff University's radio station. I found tonight really, really interesting, and I think the main thing that's come out of this tonight is how are we going to face the issue of how do we find the truth? Because there is so much out there. What I find, I agree that Twitter is a great way of finding information, but for example, whenever anything happens in the news, you have thousands of people saying a very similar thing. They might change an adjective in a tweet, and how are we meant to verify that? If somebody claims to be a journalist, are they a journalist? Do they have to have a blue tick by their name to be a journalist? What if they've had millions of blog hits? This is where we come into difficult territory.
Do you know the main thing I've learned about Twitter is even if somebody who's an ITN correspondent tweets that Mikhail Gorbachev is dead, don't retweet it. It's my biggest lesson in the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah, your colleague next to you.
Right. Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Chi Chi, and I'm currently in year 12, so I've just started A-level. And I was just thinking that in regard to surveillance, for example, as someone said earlier, I think that it is quite an issue, but I think I watched a documentary a few weeks ago, and it was about the NSA and companies like Google using a lot of our information. And I think that there has been kind of a network to kind of avoid this issue. It's called the Tor network. And I think it's been used by quite a lot of people. So, for example, there was an Arab woman, and she said that she took part in organising demonstrations in these areas which were having protests. And when the police force and military came to her house to say, you've been doing all of this, we have proof, she's actually able to turn around and say, there's no information that you have on me because of this network. So I think it's been quite successful, but the thing is there are limitations to it. So for example, connection speed and and like with this idea of online and like being anonymous online, it can be good, but it can also have issues as well. It can also be quite serious because if you have people operating online, you don't know who they are, it can be used for things such as crime. So there's this network that was started called the Silk Road, used for drug operations online. And even though it was shut down, it's come straight back up. So, there's still
I think
issues.
that's almost a very good note to begin to draw to a close on, which is the double-edged nature of almost everything that we've been discussing. Its possibilities and the things that die as a consequence, and the things that are going. That is all we have time for, even from the panel. I mean, you've been absolutely terrific. There's the last few words I'm going to offer to Ziad Morar from Sage. Sage publish our magazine, the Index magazine, of which we are incredibly proud. For us, it's a very important relationship. So, Ziad, if you want to put the last word on this, it'd be great.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ed.
Hi, all. My name is Ziad Morar. I'm Global Publishing Director at Sage. Typically fascinating, rich Index event. Two just quick thoughts that occur to me. One in a private capacity, one in a professional one, which bears on some of the questions being discussed. On the private capacity, I'm a trustee of a new charity called Ceasefire Centre, which comes out of Minority Rights Group International, and their preferred term isn't a civilian. It's a civilian-led reporting, and they're recognising the authority requirement by training people to provide evidence-worthy information and to do it in a safe and secure way, in the way that you were saying. That's part of one end of the spectrum. At the other end, putting on my professional hats, while we're publishers of Index, we're also a wide-ranging academic publisher. And what's fascinating is watching how many academics are muscling in on your journalistic act. And whoever it is of you who's at City University will know the group called The Conversation, who are sucking in academic content, hacking it into journalistic shape and putting it out on the Conversation website, where they're offering authority and coverage in different ways. I think that the background point that we need, I think, to sometimes put back into the front is that whichever configuration persists, whoever ends up getting jobs, whether it's part-time jobs, whether it's people arguing about avalanches of diarrhea, we do know that the biggest danger is if you actually curb the possibility of free expression in the first place. And certainly from the point of view, any publisher knows, publisher of anything, from magazines to books to blogs, there is a necessary condition for functioning, which is the enabling of the free circulation of ideas, even controversial, even sometimes very painful ones, which is constantly threatened, constantly curbed. So as David says, a lot of these issues are double-edged, but what I would imagine is that Index is here to always watch out for that fundamental question, which is, are there going to be curbs on free expression? And that's the necessary condition. Beyond that, you argue forever about what's good stuff, what's bad stuff, what's dangerous, what's not. And I think, anyone involved in the culture industries needs to salute that incredibly important, vitally important work. David and Jodie and Rachel clearly in the centre of a team of incredibly inspired and inspiring individuals at Index. I think have our gratitude for helping keep an eye on keeping that eternal vigilance switched on. We've been involved in Index for many years and obviously published the magazine, as David said, and we do it with great pride in the belief that we're doing something to support fundamentally that value of free expression. Many people from Sage are here this evening. Sarah Miller-McCune, who's our founder and owner, is here, who founded Sage nearly 50 years ago. It's great to see that she's here. And her stepson, David, who's our shareholder, who's also a trustee on Index, is here as well. So and many of us also, who are here in force because it's very, very close to our hearts. Even though we know we'll be publishing things that we don't like seeing, the fundamental thing is to allow the word to get out. So wonderful work that Index is doing. The magazine and the organisation needs all the support. It's not enough just to be part of these events. Get behind it whichever way you can. Support the organisation. It's doing in such important work that it can't just be left to do it by itself. Think hard about how you can make your own contribution to supporting Index, helping it flourish. Subscribe to the magazine, download the app, give the magazine Rachel was suggesting as a lovely Christmas present to somebody. But get involved. We've been doing it in various ways. I think you were mentioning that we've asked readers to nominate symbolic spaces in the fight for free expression, and those are Gezi Park in Turkey and Maidan Square in Ukraine and Wigan Pier in the UK, all of which have sort of free access to Index on Censorship for the next year as part of an attempt, but it's a symbolic attempt to get that kind of word out. What can you do to play your part in helping this organisation flourish? And thanks again to everyone for putting on such a fantastic show.
Thanks very much, Ziad. Can I just, apart from thanking the organiser and particularly David over there, who's done a fantastic job, and the people at Frontline, who, as ever, make this an amazing and brilliant place to be. I'd like to thank Ray for his extraordinary patience in South Africa. Maybe a special round of applause for Ray in South Africa. And to our platform-based, so what are we? Platform agnostic? We're multi-platform. That's right. But in this case, just in one platform.
We're literally on a platform.
Our panel here. Many thanks to them for coming, and to you for coming as well. Many of the people around will be mingling around downstairs. I'm off to watch The Apprentice.
Is that a hint about the future of journalism?